Hey everyone, so today's intro will be a bit different, so here's a quick update. YouTube has flagged my channel for invalid traffic, but I want to assure them that my viewers are genuine and not bots. To help me prove this, I kindly ask all of you to leave a comment down below. Your engagement is the best way to show that my audience is real. I appreciate your support and hope this issue gets resolved soon. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy. I was hired to guard a secret government facility. One of the creatures got loose last night. I never thought my life would take such a sharp left turn. I was just a regular guy in my mid-20s, trying to make ends meet with a boring night shift security job at a local warehouse. It paid the bills, barely, but honestly, it was soul-sucking. Staring at security cameras for 8 hours straight, with the most excitement being the occasional raccoon getting into the trash. I needed something more, something exciting, or at least better paying. That's when I got the offer. It started with a random message on a job board I'd barely used. I won't say which one, because, well, after everything that happened, I'm not sure I'm supposed to. The message was vague, but it was clear enough to grab my attention. Night security wanted. $75 per hour. Discretion required. Now, $75 an hour. That's unheard of in this line of work. I figured it had to be a scam, but curiosity got the better of me, so I replied anyway. I got a response almost instantly, with a time and address to show up for an interview. No phone call, no company name, just a meeting location about an hour outside of the city. Sketchy, right? Yeah, I thought so too. But honestly, I didn't have much to lose. My rent was creeping up, my bills were piling high, and the idea of walking away from such a potentially lucrative gig was enough to make me take the drive. So, I went. The location was odd, to say the least. I expected some dingy office in an industrial park, but instead, I found myself driving down a long, secluded road that led to what looked like an old, abandoned military base. It was covered in graffiti. The chain-link fence at the front was rusted and half-fallen, and the whole place had this eerie, forgotten vibe. If it weren't for the couple of black SUVs parked out front, I would have thought I was in the wrong place. A man in a plain black suit was waiting for me at the gate. No name tag, no introduction. He just gestured for me to follow him inside. It was all so surreal, but again, $75 an hour, man. I had to see it through. Inside the main building, it was a different story. The place was pristine, like spotless. Cold, fluorescent lights flickered above us as we walked down narrow hallways, lined with steel doors. I noticed cameras mounted in every corner, and I'm pretty sure I saw armed guards at the end of one of the corridors, though they disappeared before I could get a good look. The man led me into a small office where another guy, older and wearing a similar suit, was waiting for me behind a metal desk. He didn't waste any time with pleasantries. No name, no handshake, just straight to business. You'll be guarding a highly sensitive research facility, he said. Your job is simple. Monitor the security feeds, patrol designated areas at night, and make sure nothing gets out. You don't ask questions, you don't leave your post, and most importantly, you tell no one about what you see here. Okay, so this is the part where most people would probably turn and walk away, right? But the weirdest thing, the guy didn't feel threatening. He felt professional, like this was just business as usual for him. That, and the pay was enough to override any warning bells going off in my head. I signed a non-disclosure agreement, one of those thick ones with a lot of fine print, and they handed me a security badge. The job was mine, just like that. They even gave me an advance payment transferred directly into my account before I left. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I was already in too deep to back out. My first shift was the next night. The drive there felt surreal again. The road was empty, and as I approached the base, I noticed there were no visible signs of life. It was like the facility didn't exist unless you were supposed to be there. I was buzzed in at the gate, and this time I was escorted to the security room by another suit who, once again, didn't introduce himself. Inside, there were monitors covering the walls, showing feeds from dozens of cameras positioned all over the facility, most of them in dimly lit hallways or rooms with locked doors. A couple of the rooms had large metal containers in them, no labels, just sitting there. I was alone, aside from the occasional crackle on the radio from the armed guards stationed elsewhere in the building. My instructions were simple: watch the cameras, make rounds every hour, and report anything unusual. The first couple of nights were uneventful. Boring, actually. The facility was huge, but dead silent. It felt like no one was even working there. I'd walk down the hallways, my footsteps echoing off the metal floors, and I'd feel this weird sense of being watched, not by the cameras, but by something else. But I chalked it up to nerves. That was until last night. Last night, something changed. One of the creatures got loose, and now, I'm not sure how much longer I'll survive. It all started with a flicker on one of the monitors. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but after staring at screens for hours on end, you start to catch every little glitch. I figured it was just a camera malfunction at first. Those things happen, right? A short, a bad connection, whatever. But then I realized something. It wasn't a malfunction. The camera was in one of the restricted sections of the facility. The areas I wasn't supposed to patrol. The areas that, from what I could tell, weren't even supposed to have anyone in them. On the screen, I saw movement. Just a blur at first, like a shadow darting past the camera. I leaned in closer, narrowing my eyes, trying to make sense of it. Was it a guard? No, I would have heard from them on the radio if they were down there. My gut told me something was off, but I didn't report it. I figured it was some kind of animal. A rodent, maybe? Hey, it's a massive building. Even with all the high-tech security, you'd think they might have a pest problem. But then I saw it again. This time, clearer. It wasn't a rodent. It wasn't human, either. I don't know how to explain it without sounding crazy. The thing that moved past the camera was tall, maybe 7 feet, and hunched over, its long, spindly arms hanging unnaturally low. I couldn't make out any real features because the hallway was too dark, but the way it moved, it wasn't right. It was too fast, too smooth, like it wasn't constrained by the usual laws of nature. My hand hovered over the radio, ready to call it in, but I hesitated. What would I even say? Hey guys, there's a thing down in the restricted area. I imagined the laughter from the other end, or worse, the stern silence that would follow before they told me to mind my own business. I'd only been on the job for a week. The last thing I needed was to make a fool of myself. So, like an idiot, I stayed quiet. Big mistake. About 30 minutes later, the alarms went off. I've never heard anything like it before. This loud, bone-rattling siren that seemed to shake the entire building. Red emergency lights started flashing from every corner, turning the facility into a hellish maze of shadows and harsh crimson beams. I jumped out of my seat, my heart pounding, as the radio crackled to life. All units, report to your designated stations immediately. Containment breach in Sector D4. Repeat, containment breach. A containment breach. I didn't have time to process what that meant. My first thought was that one of the rooms had some kind of chemical leak. Maybe one of those weird containers had ruptured. But deep down, I knew it was something else. Something far worse. My instructions were clear. I wasn't to leave my post unless explicitly ordered to. But there was something about the way the alarms were blaring, the urgency in the voice on the radio, that made me feel like I wasn't as safe as I'd been led to believe. I checked the cameras again. This time, Sector D4 was in complete chaos. The once empty hallway I'd been watching earlier was now a scene straight out of a nightmare. The lights there were flickering, making it hard to see clearly. But what I did catch sent chills down my spine. That thing I'd seen earlier, it was no longer alone. There were others, at least 3 or 4 more, all of them just as tall, just as twisted and unnatural as the first. And they were moving fast, not running exactly, but gliding. Yes, gliding through the corridors with a terrifying kind of grace, their limbs bending and contorting in ways that no living thing should be able to manage. I watched, frozen, as one of the guards appeared on screen, coming around the corner with his weapon raised. He looked professional, calm, focused. These guys had to be trained for this sort of thing, right? But as soon as he saw them, I saw the fear. He opened fire. The muzzle flash lit up the screen, and for a brief second, I thought maybe he'd stopped one of them. But then, it just kept coming. The bullets didn't do a thing. The creature didn't even flinch. It just kept gliding forward, closing the distance between itself and the guard in a split second. The screen cut out for a moment, but when it came back, well, let's just say the guard wasn't there anymore. I had to move. I couldn't just sit there and wait to be next. Grabbing the only thing I had for defense, my flashlight, I bolted out of the security room. I knew I had no business being in the restricted area, but I couldn't stay where I was. If those things got into the main section of the facility, there was no telling what would happen. The thought of being trapped in there with them. No thanks. The hallways were a mess. Alarms were still going off, and I could hear the sound of heavy boots as other guards moved through the building, trying to contain the situation. I kept to the shadows, moving as quietly as I could, my heart pounding so loud I was sure it would give me away. Every creak, every distant shout or clang of metal made me flinch. My mind was racing with questions. What the hell are those things? Why isn't anyone telling us what's going on? And then I heard it. That gliding sound. It was faint, almost like a whisper, but I recognized it instantly. My stomach dropped, and I ducked into a nearby storage room, slamming the door shut behind me. I flicked off my flashlight and crouched down, pressing myself against the cold wall, trying to control my breathing. For a few moments, there was nothing, just the sound of the alarms and the distant chaos. But then, it was right outside the door. I could hear it moving, that soft, unnatural glide, like something hovering just above the ground. My hands were shaking, and I covered my mouth to keep from making any noise. The door rattled slightly, like something was testing it, but it didn't open. I don't know how long I stayed like that, crouched in the dark, barely breathing, waiting for whatever was out there to move on. Eventually, the sound faded, and I dared to peek out the small window in the door. The hallway was empty again. I was alive, for now, but I knew it wasn't over, not even close. I stayed huddled in that storage room for what felt like hours, though it was probably just a few minutes. My body was tense, every muscle coiled like a spring, ready to snap at the slightest sound. The silence that followed the creature's retreat was almost worse than the alarms. The place was still shaking with distant chaos, but whatever was out there had moved on, for now. I kept telling myself I'd be fine if I just stayed put, but deep down I knew that wasn't an option. Eventually, something would come through here, and I'd be as good as dead if I didn't make a move. I wasn't a soldier. I wasn't even a real security professional. Hell, I'd never even held a gun before this job. But instinct told me to keep going. Staying still felt like surrendering to whatever those things were. I took a deep breath and cracked the door open, just a sliver. The hallway was bathed in that awful red emergency light, shadows dancing along the walls, making it hard to tell if something was moving or if my mind was just playing tricks on me. The air felt thick, heavy, like it was charged with something unnatural. I scanned the corridor, holding my breath, listening for the slightest noise. Nothing. I stepped out, keeping low, hugging the wall as I moved. The facility was like a labyrinth, endless hallways, and identical doors stretching out in every direction. Every step I took felt like a gamble. I wasn't sure where I was going or what I'd find, but I knew I needed to get out of the restricted zone. There had to be an exit somewhere, or at least a safer area where I could figure out what the hell was happening. I passed a few rooms that were sealed shut, their heavy metal doors locked with electronic panels that blinked with red lights. Each time I saw one, I couldn't help but wonder what was behind it. Whatever they were keeping in here, it wasn't just classified research. These things, these creatures, weren't natural. They weren't even close. And yet, they were here, roaming free because someone, somewhere, had failed to contain them. As I crept down another hallway, I heard voices up ahead. Human voices. For the first time that night, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe there were survivors, other guards, or maybe some of the staff. People who knew more than I did. People who could help. I picked up the pace, moving toward the sound, careful not to make too much noise. When I turned the corner, I saw them. 2 guards, standing in front of a door that looked a lot more reinforced than the others. One of them was frantically typing something into a keypad, while the other kept looking over his shoulder, his rifle at the ready. They were panicking. I could feel the tension rolling off them in waves. Before I could call out to them, the door behind them swung open, and they rushed inside, slamming it shut before I had the chance to reach them. My heart sank. I ran up to the door and pounded on it, whispering hoarsely, "Let me in. I'm with security. Please." I kept my voice low, terrified that I might draw attention to myself. But there was no answer, just the dull, metallic sound of the door vibrating under my fists. That flicker of hope was gone as quickly as it had come. I looked around, realizing how exposed I was. This hallway was way too open for my liking, and the more time I spent out here, the more likely something was going to find me. The only way forward was to keep moving, and I couldn't waste time trying to convince people to open doors that weren't going to budge. I forced myself to keep going, trying to push down the rising panic in my chest. The further I went, the weirder things started to feel. The air grew colder, and there was this faint buzzing sound, like static, but distant, barely audible, yet constantly there. My skin prickled, and I had this overwhelming sense that something was watching me, not just from the cameras either. I felt it everywhere, like the walls themselves had eyes. I turned another corner, and that's when I saw it. The hallway ahead was darker than the others, the emergency lights flickering weakly, casting long, erratic shadows. And standing at the far end, partially hidden in the darkness, was one of them. It was different from the others I'd seen on the cameras. This one was thinner, its body elongated and twisted, its skin a pale, almost translucent gray. Its head was too big for its body, and its eyes, or what I thought were eyes, were just empty, black voids. It wasn't moving. It was just standing there, staring at me from the shadows. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. We locked eyes, or at least I think we did, and for a long, horrible moment, neither of us moved. My instincts were screaming at me to run, to get as far away from it as possible, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. It was like I was caught in a trance, held by some invisible force. Then, it tilted its head, slowly, deliberately. It wasn't moving toward me, but the way it was staring made me feel like I was already being hunted. My brain was screaming that this was wrong. All of this was wrong, and I needed to get out of there. Now suddenly, I heard a soft, clicking sound coming from behind me. I didn't even have to turn around to know what it was. Another one of those things was creeping up on me. I could feel it, the soft, rhythmic click of its claws, or feet, or whatever it used to move, echoing down the corridor. They were closing in. I don't know how, but I finally managed to snap out of it. My legs moved on their own, and I took off, running faster than I ever had in my life. I didn't look back. I didn't have to. I could hear them, that soft, gliding movement, chasing after me, faster than I could ever hope to run. I darted around corners, nearly slipping on the slick floor, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. My lungs burned, my muscles screaming with exhaustion, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't let them catch me. I found another door up ahead, slightly ajar, and without thinking, I threw myself inside, slamming it shut behind me. I pressed my back against it, bracing for the inevitable thud of one of those creatures trying to break through. But nothing happened. The clicking sound stopped. The gliding movement faded into silence. I held my breath, waiting, terrified that they might just be toying with me, waiting for me to make a mistake. But after a few long, agonizing minutes, I realized they weren't coming for me. At least, not right now. I looked around the room, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. It wasn't a storage room like the last one. This one was different. There were rows of computers, screens flickering, with streams of code and diagrams. On one of the screens, I saw a blueprint of the facility, and in the center of it, there was a large, red circle, a containment chamber, and it was labeled Specimen 10. I don't know what they were keeping down there, or what had gotten loose, but one thing was clear. I wasn't supposed to survive the night. I stared at the screen, the words Specimen X burning into my brain. That's when it all clicked. These things, these creatures, whatever they weren't accidents. They weren't natural. They were made. And the fact that something as terrifying as the things I'd seen wasn't the worst of them, that was enough to make me sick to my stomach. But what the hell was Specimen X? I scrolled through the screen, looking for more details. My fingers shook as I swiped through lines of data. most of it coded gibberish that I couldn't even begin to understand. There were some medical terms, a few references to genetic manipulation, words like mutation and cross-species hybridization. Every new word made me more certain that this wasn't just a government facility. This was something far darker, something far worse. As I scrolled further, a window popped up on the screen. It was a security feed, showing the containment chamber that had been marked on the blueprint. The camera angle was odd, like it was mounted high up in the corner of the room, watching everything from above. And in the center of the frame, I saw it, the containment unit. It was huge, towering over everything else in the room. Massive steel walls, reinforced with what looked like layers of thick glass, each panel held in place by huge mechanical locks. And inside that chamber, something moved. I could barely make it out at first, just a shape, shifting in the darkness, the shadows playing tricks on my mind. But then, as the camera flickered and adjusted, I saw it more clearly. It was enormous. Even hunched over, it looked like it would dwarf the other creatures I'd seen roaming the halls. Its skin, or whatever passed for skin, was pale and leathery, with strange dark veins running just beneath the surface, pulsating rhythmically. Its limbs were long and grotesquely proportioned, fingers ending in sharp, bone-like claws that scratched lazily against the steel walls. But its face, God, its face, it had no eyes. Where they should have been, there was only smooth, featureless skin. Its mouth, though, was wide, unnaturally so, filled with rows of jagged, uneven teeth that didn't seem to fit together quite right. And as it moved, I realized that the thing wasn't fully awake. It was stirring, like it had been in some sort of deep sleep, and was only just starting to come to. The security feed had a countdown timer in the corner. 30 minutes. That's all that was left before something happened. Whether that was the end of the containment protocol or a complete failure of the system, I had no idea. All I knew was that I did not want to be here when that timer hit 0. I needed to get out. Now I forced myself to pull away from the screen, taking one last glance at the blueprint. There, on the far side of the building, was an exit I hadn't noticed before. It was marked as an emergency evac route, but I wasn't sure if it was even still accessible. Half of the facility was in lockdown, and God only knows how many more of those creatures were roaming the hallways. Still, I didn't have a choice. My best bet was to follow the blueprint, avoid the restricted sectors, and pray that I could make it to that exit before anything else found me. I opened the door cautiously, listening for that familiar clicking sound. The hallways were eerily quiet now. No alarms, no guards, no footsteps, just silence, which only made everything feel worse. It felt like the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something, waiting for Specimen X to wake up completely. I crept down the corridor, sticking close to the walls, moving as quietly as I could. The lights were still flickering, casting these strange, distorted shadows that made it impossible to tell what was real and what was my mind playing tricks on me. I kept my flashlight off, relying on the red emergency lights to guide my way. As I rounded another corner, I came face to face with one of the creatures. I froze. It hadn't seen me yet. It was hunched over, facing away from me, its long, sinewy arms dragging along the floor as it moved sluggishly down the hallway. My heart was in my throat as I pressed myself against the wall, barely breathing, hoping, praying that it wouldn't turn around. Slowly, painfully slowly, It passed by me, its strange clicking footsteps fading into the distance. I waited a few more agonizing seconds before I dared to move again, my legs feeling like jelly beneath me. My head was spinning, every part of my body screaming for me to run, but I knew better than to panic. If I made a sound, if I moved too fast, it would all be over. I kept going, step by step, my eyes darting to every shadow, every corner, expecting one of them to lunge at me at any moment. The blueprint had shown the emergency exit just a few turns away. If I could just make it there, I could get out, get help, and never look back. I swore to myself that I'd never take another shady job again. No amount of money was worth this. But then I heard something that stopped me, dead in my tracks. A low rumbling growl echoing from somewhere deep in the building. It wasn't like the noises the smaller creatures had made. This was something bigger, something angrier. It was awake. I turned the next corner and saw the emergency exit door at the far end of the hallway. My heart leapt into my throat again, but this time with hope. I was so close. I broke into a run, every part of me screaming to move faster, to get out of this nightmare before it was too late. And then the walls shook. The entire facility trembled with the force of something massive moving below. I could feel it, deep in my bones, the weight of it, the raw, terrifying power. Whatever Specimen X was, it was fully awake now, and it wasn't happy. The red lights above me flickered violently, and I heard it, the unmistakable sound of metal tearing, echoing through the hallways like a thunderclap. It was loose. The timer had run out, and Specimen X had broken free. I reached the door and slammed into it with everything I had. It didn't budge. Panic surged through me as I realized it was locked, electronically sealed, just like the others. My heart pounded in my ears, my breath coming in shallow, frantic gasps. I fumbled for the security card they'd given me, swiping it through the reader over and over, but nothing happened. The lights on the reader blinked red, mocking me, taunting me with the knowledge that I was trapped. Behind me, the growling grew louder. I turned, and for the first time, I could feel it moving toward me. Not just the sound, but this awful, crushing sense of presence, like the very air was being sucked out of the hallway. The shadows around me seemed to stretch and warp, and the temperature dropped, a bone-chilling cold that seeped into my skin. I had no choice. I turned and ran, deeper into the facility, knowing full well that the deeper I went, the closer I was getting to the thing I feared most. Specimen 10 was hunting me now. I ran deeper into the facility, my mind racing as fast as my legs. Every footfall echoed in the hollow metal hallways, and I knew it wouldn't take long for that thing, Specimen X, to track me down. The growling behind me had intensified, the sound vibrating through the walls like some kind of animal rage, and it was getting closer. I could feel it, this looming force that seemed to defy all logic, something ancient and wrong. My lungs burned as I tore through the maze of corridors. Every corner I turned, every hallway I sprinted down, felt the same, like I was going in circles. It was impossible to tell where I was. The flickering red emergency lights cast long, grotesque shadows, twisting the narrow spaces into something claustrophobic, something that felt alive. The facility, once so sterile and controlled, had turned into a nightmare, and I was just another rat scrambling to get out. The worst part? I could still hear it, that clicking sound. It wasn't just Specimen X after me. No, those other things, the smaller creatures, were hunting too. gliding silently through the darkness, trekking me like wolves, closing in on their prey. I couldn't see them, but I knew they were there, lurking just beyond the edges of my vision, waiting for me to slip up. I stumbled into a larger room, gasping for breath. It was different from the rest of the facility, a wide, open area with rows of strange equipment lining the walls. The ceiling stretched higher than the other rooms, and in the center, there was this massive glass window that looked down into a dark, cavernous space below. A control room, maybe? I didn't have time to think about it. I scanned the room, desperately looking for an escape. There was another door at the far end, but just as I started toward it, a low, guttural noise filled the air. I froze. The glass window behind me cracked, a web of fractures spreading out like jagged lightning. Something heavy had slammed against it from the other side. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I already knew what was down there. Specimen 10. The growling grew louder, more feral, and the glass shuddered under the force of another blow. The creature was down there, in the pit below, but not for long. I had seconds, maybe less. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it would explode. I forced my legs to move, sprinting toward the door, but as I reached it, I heard something else. A soft, familiar clicking sound coming from behind the walls. They were here. The smaller creatures were moving through the ventilation system, closing in. I could hear them skittering above me, through the ducts, like spiders crawling through the facility's veins, waiting to drop down on me. My hand shook as I grabbed the handle of the door and yanked, but it was locked. Of course, it was locked. My panic was reaching a fever pitch now, my thoughts racing, spinning out of control. Think. I glanced back at the cracked glass. One more hit, and it would shatter completely. I had no time. I looked around the room for anything that might help. That's when I saw it. A control panel mounted on the wall, with a lever marked Emergency Override. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was the only shot I had left. I ran to the panel, flipping open the plastic cover and pulling the lever as hard as I could. There was a deafening screech as the metal doors on the far side of the room slammed shut, sealing the ventilation ducts. The clicking noises stopped, replaced by the sound of angry screeches coming from the creatures trapped inside. I had bought myself a few more seconds, but that's all I had. With a deafening crash, the glass window behind me shattered. Shards rained down, slicing through the air as I threw myself to the ground, covering my head. The temperature dropped instantly, like the air itself was being sucked into the abyss below. The sound that came next was unlike anything I'd ever heard. A roar that was more than just a sound. It was like the air was vibrating, like reality itself was being bent out of shape. I dared to look up, and there it was. Specimen 10 climbed through the shattered window, pulling its massive, grotesque body into the room. Up close, it was even more horrifying than it had been on the screen. Its head twisted unnaturally as it crawled over the edge, its eyeless face locked onto me. It didn't need eyes. It could sense me, smell me, whatever it was. I was its target, and it was hungry. I scrambled to my feet, backing up toward the sealed door as the thing lumbered toward me, its long claws scraping against the floor, leaving deep gouges in the metal. The air around it felt wrong, like it was distorting everything around it, bending the space in ways my brain couldn't process. I was out of time. There was no way out, nowhere to run. In a last, desperate move, I reached for the control panel again, this time slamming my hand down on the largest button I could find. I didn't know what it did, but I didn't care. At that point, anything was better than nothing. Suddenly, the floor beneath Specimen X split open, a trapdoor. I hadn't seen it before, but it had been there the whole time. With a deafening roar, the creature lost its balance, its massive claws scrabbling at the edges of the opening, trying to hold on. I watched in disbelief as its twisted form slipped, crashing down into the darkness below. Its roar echoed through the facility as it disappeared into the abyss, the sound fading into the distance. I couldn't believe it. It was gone. I stood there gasping for breath, my legs shaking beneath me. The room was silent now, except for the distant hum of the facility systems slowly powering down. My mind was spinning, still trying to catch up with what had just happened, but I wasn't safe yet. The building was still in lockdown, and I knew it was only a matter of time before something else went wrong. I had to get out. My hands were trembling as I tried the door again. This time, it opened. The emergency override had worked. I stepped into the hallway, glancing back at the dark pit where Specimen X had fallen. It wasn't dead. I could feel that much. But for now, at least, it was trapped. I didn't look back again. I just ran. The facility was eerily quiet as I made my way through the emergency exit route. The guards were gone, the alarms had stopped, and the creatures, well, maybe they were still there, lurking in the shadows. But I wasn't sticking around to find out. When I finally reached the surface, the cold night air hit me like a wave of relief. I stumbled into the empty parking lot, my heart still racing, my clothes soaked with sweat. The black SUVs were still there, but they were abandoned. No one was coming for me. I got in my car and drove. I didn't care where, just away. Away from that nightmare. Away from the secrets I was never meant to know. It's been 3 days now, and I still don't know what's going to happen next. I haven't told anyone. Who would believe me? But I can't shake the feeling that this isn't over. I know they'll come looking for me eventually, and I know Specimen X isn't done with me yet. I guard an underground government prison. One of the cells is empty, but it's not. Alright, so before I even get into the meat of this, I need to clear up a few things. I know this might sound insane, but everything I'm about to tell you is real. You can believe me or not, it's up to you. But by the end of this, I think you'll at least understand why I've been losing sleep. Let me back up. I work as a security guard for a, let's just say, high security facility. It's underground, tucked away in the middle of nowhere, and technically, it doesn't exist. Yeah, one of those places. No cell signal, no Wi-Fi, no real connection to the outside world. Even if you did know where it was, you wouldn't see anything but trees and hills. The entrance is camouflaged, hidden behind an old maintenance shed, and the rest of it, deep underground. I've been doing this job for almost 5 years now, and I've seen some stuff that would probably get me blacklisted from the planet if I talked about it. But to be honest, nothing has ever really freaked me out. Sure, the prisoners are odd, to say the least. They're not your typical criminals. These guys aren't in here for robbing banks or running scams. They're here because they know things, or they've done things that no one should know or do. Or maybe they've seen things the government wants buried so deep they put them in a literal hole in the ground. Anyway, about 3 months ago, I started working night shifts exclusively. This was by choice. Fewer people around, less noise, and I could spend most of the time monitoring cameras in a control room instead of patrolling the halls. Perfect, right? At least it was. Until a few weeks ago when, well, something changed. It was around 2 a.m. My shift was dragging, and the hum of the control room equipment was practically lulling me to sleep. I was sipping on a stale cup of coffee when I saw it, on camera 12. It was just a flash at first, something barely noticeable, but enough to make me rewind the footage. Camera 12 is pointed down the east wing, where some of the oldest cells are. Most of them haven't been in use for years, but there's one in particular that always gets me. Cell 7. It's marked as empty in the logs. Has been for as long as I've been working here. No one goes in, no one comes out, just an empty cell. Except, it's not. When I rewound the footage, I saw it again. A brief flicker, like the lights dimmed for half a second. Then, I swear to God, the door to cell 7 moved. Not a lot, just a little. It's a heavy steel door, and there's no way it could have moved on its own. The air down here is dry, and the doors are magnetic. They lock shut unless you're standing right there with the key card. But this door had shifted, just a fraction, like something was on the other side pushing against it. I stared at the screen for what felt like an hour, but nothing else happened. The door stayed put. I told myself it was just a glitch in the feed, or some weird electrical interference, but in the back of my mind, something felt off. I should have just let it go, but my curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight, swiped my keycard, and headed down to the east wing. The halls are long, cold, and practically silent at night. The only sound is your own footsteps echoing off the concrete. I passed by the occupied cells, most of the prisoners either asleep or mumbling to themselves, and eventually made it to cell 7. Now, here's where things start to get strange. The door was closed, just like I'd left it when I came on shift. But as I got closer, I noticed something. There was this low, barely audible hum. At first, I thought it was just the sound of the ventilation system, but it felt different, almost like it was coming from the walls themselves. I shined my flashlight on the door, and that's when I saw it. The tiny window in the door, the one that's supposed to be pitch black because the cell is empty. It wasn't. There was a faint light inside, like someone had left a single dim bulb on. Except, here's the kicker. There's no light fixture in cell 7. There's nothing in there at all. No bed, no toilet, no electrical wiring. It's supposed to be just a cement box. I peered through the window, trying to see where the light was coming from. The room looked just as empty as always, but the light was definitely there, coming from something. I couldn't tell what it was, but it was faint, like a flickering candle or a dying flashlight. It didn't make any sense. At that point, I should have walked away. I should have reported it to my supervisor and let them deal with it. But I didn't. I don't know if it was the sleep deprivation or my own stupid curiosity, but I swiped my keycard and unlocked the door. The second I opened it, that hum I'd heard earlier got louder, almost like it was vibrating in my chest. The light inside flickered once, then went out completely, plunging the cell back into darkness. I stood there, frozen in the doorway, my flashlight beam cutting through the pitch black. The cell was empty, just like it always had been. But as I stood there, staring into the darkness, I got the distinct feeling that I wasn't alone. You know that feeling you get when someone's watching you? That prickling sensation on the back of your neck. Yeah, that. It hit me all at once, like a wave of cold air rushing out of the cell. My hand tightened on the flashlight, and I stepped back, slamming the door shut behind me. I don't know how long I stood there, heart pounding, staring at the door like something might burst through at any second. But nothing did. The hum slowly faded away, and everything went silent again. I went back to the control room, feeling like an idiot. I spent the rest of the night glued to camera 12, but nothing else happened. The door stayed closed. The cell stayed dark. But here's the thing. It wasn't a glitch. I know what I saw. I felt it. And this is just the beginning. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong with Cell 7. You know how sometimes you'll see or hear something weird, and your brain just keeps replaying it, trying to make sense of it? Yeah, it was like that, but way worse. Every time I thought about what had happened, that cold sensation crept back in, like whatever was inside that cell had left a mark on me. I didn't mention it to anyone at work. Maybe I didn't want to sound paranoid, or maybe I just didn't trust anyone else enough to believe me. I mean, this place runs on secrecy. People don't ask questions here. We're just supposed to keep our heads down, do our shifts, and go home like none of it matters. But once you've seen something like that, it's impossible to go back to normal. I kept watching the cameras, especially camera 12, every night, like I was waiting for something else to happen. At first, nothing did. It was quiet, almost too quiet. A week went by without any issues. The door to cell 7 didn't move again, and there were no more flickers of light. I tried to convince myself it had been a one-off, maybe some freak electrical surge, or a trick of my tired brain. But then, exactly 10 days after the first incident, I saw it again. It was around 3:30 a.m., and I was in the control room, half zoned out, staring at the screen, when that same flicker caught my eye. My stomach dropped. The door to cell 7 hadn't moved, but this time I could hear something. At first, it was so faint that I wasn't even sure if it was real. It sounded like whispers, not the kind you hear in movies, like someone talking clearly under their breath. No, this was more like multiple voices blending together, all saying different things at once. It was barely audible over the hum of the equipment, but it was there, coming through the feed from camera 12. I cranked the volume on the control panel, pressing my ear closer, trying to make out what the voices were saying. But the more I listened, the less it made sense. It wasn't in English. Hell, I don't think it was in any language I'd ever heard before. It was like a low, rhythmic chanting, overlapping in a way that made my skin crawl. I could feel my heart start to race. My first instinct was to get up, grab my flashlight, and head back to cell 7. But then I remembered how things went last time. I remembered that hum, the cold rush of air, the feeling that something was watching me from the dark. My hand froze on the armrest of my chair. The whispers got louder. It wasn't coming from the speakers anymore. It was coming from the walls of the control room. I swear to God, I could feel the sound vibrating through the floor beneath me. It was like the whole building was buzzing with this low, guttural noise. I glanced at the monitors again. Everything else was normal. The other cameras showed nothing out of the ordinary, just empty hallways and cells. But camera 12, the feed was starting to glitch out. For a split second, the screen went black. When it came back, the camera angle had shifted slightly. I don't even know how that's possible. These cameras are locked in place, bolted to the ceiling. But now, Instead of just showing the hallway in front of cell 7, it was angled toward the door, and then I saw it. There was something standing in front of the door. At first I couldn't make out any details. The figure was blurry, like a shadow caught in the corner of your eye, flickering in and out of focus, but I could see its shape. Tall, almost unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. It didn't move. It just stood there, facing the door, as if it were waiting for something. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I couldn't look away from the screen. I tried to reach for the radio to call one of the other guards, but my hand wouldn't move. It was like I was stuck in place, frozen by the sheer wrongness of what I was seeing. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, and I could feel that cold, prickling sensation creeping up the back of my neck again. Then, the door to cell 7 opened. I'm not exaggerating. It swung open slowly, like someone on the other side was pulling it, even though there was no one there. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring into the darkness of the cell. I couldn't breathe. The camera feed flickered again, and when it came back, the figure was gone. The door was closed, as if nothing had happened. I sat there for what felt like hours, just staring at the screen, trying to process what I'd just seen. My hand was still hovering over the radio, but I couldn't bring myself to use it. What was I going to say? That a door that's supposed to stay locked just opened on its own? That I saw something, someone, standing there, even though the cell is supposed to be empty? I knew what kind of response I'd get. At best, they'd think I was losing it. At worst, well, I didn't want to think about that. People who ask too many questions around here don't tend to stick around long. I kept watching the monitors for the rest of my shift, but nothing else happened. No more whispers, no more figures, just that same cold silence that fills this place at night. By the time my shift ended, I felt like I was going crazy. I almost didn't want to leave the control room, like stepping out into the hallway might put me right in front of whatever was lurking near cell 7. But I had to go. I grabbed my stuff, kept my head down, and made my way to the elevator. As I was about to swipe my card to leave, I heard it again. A single whisper, this time clear as day. It said my name. I didn't go back to work for 3 days after that shift. Technically, I called in sick, but the truth is, I was just terrified to step foot in that place again. I couldn't stop hearing that voice, the whisper of my name, over and over. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see that shadowy figure standing outside cell 7, waiting. I couldn't explain it, and I didn't want to try. The 3 days off was all I could take. You don't just walk away from a job like mine. Too many questions get asked, and the people who run this place, they don't tolerate loose ends. So, I went back. I told myself it was just stress. Maybe I'd been working too many night shifts, and it was getting to my head. Lack of sleep, too much coffee, staring at the same camera feeds for hours on end. All that could mess with anyone's mind, right? I tried to believe it. I really did. The first few hours of my shift were normal. Nothing strange on the cameras. No weird whispers coming from the walls. It was quiet, almost like nothing had ever happened. By midnight, I was starting to feel a little less paranoid. Maybe things had just been a fluke after all. Maybe I really had imagined the whole thing. Then, around 1:45 a.m., the lights in the hallway leading to cell 7 flickered again. It wasn't much, just a brief dimming, like a surge in the power grid. But I noticed it immediately. my eyes snapping to the monitor showing the east wing. The door to cell 7 was still closed. No sign of the shadowy figure, no movement. But something was off. The air in the control room suddenly felt heavy, like the pressure had dropped, and I could feel that cold, prickling sensation creeping up the back of my neck again. I got up, grabbed my flashlight, and headed for the east wing. Every step felt heavier than the last, like I was walking through water. My instincts were screaming at me to turn around, to go back to the safety of the control room. But I couldn't. I had to check it out. I had to know what was happening with cell 7. When I reached the door, everything looked normal. No strange noises, no flickering light inside. Just a cold, empty hallway. I stared at the door for a few seconds, debating whether I should open it. I didn't want to, but I also couldn't shake the feeling that something was different this time. Something was drawing me in, almost like an invisible hand was reaching out, urging me to come closer. I swiped my keycard and unlocked the door. It swung open with that same slow, heavy groan as before, and I aimed my flashlight into the cell. Just like last time, it was empty. No bed, no light fixtures, nothing but bare cement walls and a concrete floor. But there was something new. Scrawled across the back wall, in what looked like thick, dark scratches, was a word. My name. I stood there, frozen, staring at it. The letters were jagged, uneven, like they'd been carved into the cement with something sharp. My flashlight beam flickered as I moved closer, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. The air in the cell was freezing, colder than the rest of the facility, and that low hum from before was back, vibrating through the walls. My name. How the hell did my name get there? I ran my fingers over the letters, half expecting them to be some kind of illusion, but they were real. Deep, rough grooves dug into the cement. I pulled my hand back, and for a split second, I could have sworn I felt a faint warmth coming from the scratches, like the wall itself was pulsing with some kind of energy. And then I heard it again, that voice, the whisper, soft, barely more than a breath, but clear enough to send a chill down my spine. Come, closer. I stumbled back, my flashlight slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. The beam bounced wildly, casting long, jittery shadows across the walls. I scrambled to grab it, my pulse racing, but the light flickered again, and for a moment I saw something moving in the corner of the cell. It was only there for a split second, a shape, a shadow. Something wrong. It didn't have a face, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. I grabbed my flashlight and backed out of the cell as fast as I could, slamming the door behind me. The second it closed, the humming stopped. The air in the hallway felt normal again, like nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. I practically ran back to the control room, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly, it took me 3 tries to type in the security code. Once I was inside, I slumped into the chair and stared at the monitors, trying to catch my breath. The cameras showed nothing. The hallway outside cell 7 was still and silent. The door closed tight. I switched to camera 12 and rewound the footage, hoping to catch something on tape. But it was the same story as before. The feed glitched just as I'd opened the door, cutting out for a few seconds before coming back online. By the time the picture cleared, I was already running out of the hallway. No proof. No explanation. I sat there for the rest of the night, watching the monitors with my back pressed against the wall. Every time I thought about what I'd seen, about my name carved into that wall, it felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. How did it get there? Who or what put it there? And why the hell did it feel like whatever was in that cell knew me? By the end of my shift, I had made up my mind. I was going to talk to someone. I didn't care if it got me fired or worse. I had to tell someone what was going on. There was no way I could keep working in that place, not with whatever was happening in cell 7. But as I was gathering my things, I heard a knock at the control room door. It was quiet, barely noticeable over the hum of the equipment. I froze, listening. Another knock, louder this time. I stared at the door, my heart in my throat. No one should have been down there with me. No one ever comes to the control room during the night shift. Another knock. Then a voice, muffled but familiar. Come closer. I didn't wait. I grabbed my stuff, bolted for the emergency exit, and didn't stop running until I was outside, breathing in the cold night air. I haven't been back since. But here's the thing. I don't think I'm safe. Whatever was in that cell, it's not done with me. I can feel it. Every time I'm alone, I swear I hear whispers. I see shadows out of the corner of my eye. And every time I do, I can feel it getting closer. I didn't sleep that first night after I ran. How could I? My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what happened. But the more I thought about it, the less it made sense. There was no logical explanation for what I'd seen, or for what I'd heard. The scratches on the wall, the shadow, the voice, it all pointed to one impossible conclusion. Whatever was in cell 7 was something far beyond anything I'd ever encountered. For the first time, I wondered if maybe cell 7 wasn't a prison for some dangerous criminal or rogue agent. Maybe it was holding something worse, something no one could control. I spent the next day pacing around my apartment, checking the locks on my door, peering through the blinds like a paranoid wreck. My phone kept buzzing with messages from work, missed calls, voicemails, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. They were probably pissed I'd bailed on my shift, but after everything that had happened, going back there was out of the question. I kept telling myself I just needed time to think, to figure out my next move. But by the time night rolled around, I started to notice strange things. It started small, little noises in the apartment, the sound of my fridge kicking on, the hum of the AC. Nothing unusual at first, but in the back of my mind, I knew. It was too quiet. That silence you get in the dead of night, when the whole world seems to stop breathing. That was creeping into my apartment, and with it came the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid, that my mind was just playing tricks on me after everything at the facility. But as the night went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. You know how, when you're home alone, you can just tell when something isn't right? It was like that. I kept hearing faint creaks, soft thuds, like footsteps, but distant, always just out of reach. It felt like the walls were closing in on me, that same cold hum from cell 7 vibrating through the air. Around midnight, I got up to grab a glass of water. I'd been sitting on my couch, watching TV with the volume low, trying to distract myself, but every little noise was making me jump. The second I stood up, I heard it. That same whisper, only this time, it wasn't faint, or muffled, or distant. It was right behind me. I froze. My whole body tensed up, and I could feel the blood drain from my face. The voice was so close, I could almost feel its breath on the back of my neck. Come closer. I whipped around, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was nothing there. Just my empty living room, bathed in the soft glow of the TV. I stood there shaking, listening for any other sounds, but the apartment was completely still. Too still. My skin prickled with that same cold dread I'd felt outside cell 7. I couldn't stay there. I grabbed my keys and bolted out the door, not even bothering to turn off the lights behind me. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to get out, to be anywhere but inside that apartment. I drove around aimlessly for hours, trying to clear my head, but the whole time that voice was stuck in my mind, replaying over and over again like a broken record. When I finally made my way back home, the sun was starting to come up. My apartment building looked normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me inside. I sat in the car for what felt like an eternity, staring up at the windows, dreading the thought of going back in. But I couldn't just sit there forever. I walked up the stairs slowly, my heart pounding harder with each step. The door to my apartment was exactly how I'd left it, locked and secure. I hesitated for a moment before turning the key and stepping inside. The second I walked in, I knew something was wrong. There was a smell, faint but unmistakable, like burnt metal, sharp and acrid, hanging in the air. It hit me the moment I crossed the threshold, and I nearly gagged. I flicked on the lights and looked around, but everything was in its place. My furniture, my stuff. Nothing had been touched. But that smell, it was getting stronger. I moved cautiously, checking every room, my hands shaking as I opened closets and peered behind doors. I kept expecting to see something lurking in the shadows, something waiting for me, but the apartment was empty, except for one thing. On the wall, right above my couch, were the same jagged scratches I'd seen in cell 7. My name, carved into the drywall. I backed up so fast, I nearly tripped over the coffee table. It wasn't possible. I hadn't been gone for more than a few hours. There was no way anyone could have broken in, done that, and left without a trace. And that's when I saw it. A shadow. Just a flicker. A dark shape moving out of the corner of my eye. I whipped around, shining my phone's flashlight in every direction, but the room was still. Quiet. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. I could feel it. Something was there, hiding just out of sight, watching me. I ran. I didn't care where I was going. I just ran. Down the stairs, out into the street, barely stopping to lock the door behind me. I jumped in my car and floored it, my hand shaking so badly I could barely keep the wheel straight. I didn't go back to the apartment that night. I didn't even go back to the same town. I drove for hours, straight out into the middle of nowhere, checking into the first motel I could find. I must have looked like hell when I walked in, bloodshot eyes, sweat pouring down my face, because the guy at the desk didn't ask any questions. He handed me a room key, and I went inside, deadbolting the door behind me. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I heard that voice, that whisper. It wasn't just in my head anymore. It was in the room with me, closer than ever. I kept the lights on all night, sitting with my back against the wall, watching the shadows move across the room. I knew deep down that no matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, it would follow me. It had already attached itself to me, marked me. It wasn't tied to the facility or to cell 7 anymore. It was tied to me. By dawn, I made a decision. I couldn't live like this, constantly running, constantly looking over my shoulder. Whatever this thing was, whatever I'd let out of that cell, it wasn't going to stop until it had me, until I gave in. But I wasn't about to just roll over and let it win. No way. I needed to go back to the facility, back to cell 7. I didn't know what I was going to do when I got there, or how I was going to stop whatever this was, but one thing was clear. This thing wanted me. It had my name, my life, and maybe, just maybe, if I faced it head on, I could find a way to end it. So I packed my stuff, checked out of the motel, and headed back toward the facility, toward the place where it all started, where it would all have to end. I drove back to the facility with a pit in my stomach, the kind of deep sinking dread that gets worse with every mile closer I got. I knew this was insane, going back to the place where it all started, where the thing in cell 7 had first made contact with me. But I didn't have a choice. Whatever it was, it had been to my apartment. It had followed me to that motel. Running wasn't an option anymore. I had to end this. The road leading to the facility was just as empty and isolated as I remembered. The morning fog clung low to the ground, and the trees lining the path felt more like silent sentinels than nature. By the time I pulled up to the hidden entrance, the sun hadn't even broken through the haze yet. The whole place was drenched in that eerie twilight gray, the kind that makes everything look a little off. I parked the car and stared at the entrance. The camouflage shed that hid the elevator into the underground compound loomed in front of me like a mouth waiting to swallow me whole. For a moment, I almost turned around, almost drove away and never looked back. But then I remembered the scratches on my wall, the voice that had whispered my name, the shadow that had followed me. It was either face this thing or let it consume me. I walked to the door of the shed, swiping my keycard to unlock it. The mechanical whir of the hidden door sliding open sounded louder than usual in the stillness of the morning. I stepped inside and made my way to the elevator, swiping my card again and pressing the button for the lower level. The ride down felt like it took forever, the air growing heavier and colder with each passing second. When the elevator doors slid open, I stepped into the familiar underground hallways. The place was dead silent. No guards, no staff, just long stretches of empty corridors lit by the flickering overhead lights. It felt like the entire facility was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I made my way toward the east wing, toward cell 7. Every step felt like a countdown to something inevitable, like I was walking straight into a trap. But I couldn't stop myself. I had to know. I had to see it through. When I reached the hallway, where cell 7 was located, I froze. The door was already open, not like before, where it had shifted slightly on the camera feed. This time, it was wide open, the blackness inside stretching out like a void. I stood there, staring into the darkness, my heart hammering in my chest. The air in the hallway was cold, unnaturally cold. It wasn't just a chill. It was the kind of cold that sinks into your bones, that feels like it's pulling the warmth right out of you. And then, from the darkness, I heard it. That voice, that same whisper, clear as ever. Come closer. I didn't move. I couldn't. My feet were rooted to the floor, my entire body frozen in place. But I knew that if I stayed there, if I kept standing in that hallway, something worse was going to happen. That door wasn't just open, it was inviting me in, and I wasn't sure I'd come back if I stepped through. I took a deep breath, trying to steel myself, and walked forward. The second I crossed the threshold into the cell, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, heart racing, but there was no handle on the inside, no way out. I was trapped. The cell was pitch black. I could barely see my own hand in front of my face. The cold was even worse in here, cutting through my skin, making every breath feel sharp and painful. But more than that, I could feel something in the room with me, something waiting, and then the whispers started again, louder this time. They filled the room, overlapping, a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, but none of them made sense. It was like hearing 100 different conversations at once, none of them in any language I understood. But at the center of it all, one voice stood out, the same voice that had whispered my name. I backed up, pressing myself against the cold cement wall, my eyes straining in the darkness, trying to make out any shape or movement. The whispers grew louder, circling me, swirling in the air like they were coming from everywhere at once. I could feel the pressure building in my head, like my skull was being squeezed from the inside. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, the figure. It was standing in the corner of the cell, just like I'd seen it on the camera feed. Tall, impossibly thin, its limbs too long, too distorted to be human. It didn't have a face, just a dark, empty void where its head should have been. And yet, I could feel it looking at me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My heart was pounding so hard, it felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. The whispers grew louder. The figure stepping closer, its movements slow and deliberate, like it was savoring the moment. I pressed myself harder against the wall, desperate to get away, but there was nowhere to go. The figure moved closer, and as it did, the cold in the room intensified, the air thick with that humming vibration. I could feel it deep inside me, like the entire cell was alive, pulsing with some kind of malevolent energy. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the whispers stopped. The figure was right in front of me now, looming over me, its presence so overwhelming that it felt like the air was being sucked out of the room. And then, in that dead silence, it spoke. "You let me out." Its voice was deep, resonant, like it wasn't coming from its mouth, if it even had one, but from everywhere around me, vibrating in my bones. "You let me out, and now I'm free." I felt the room closing in on me, the walls pressing tighter and tighter, the cold so intense that I could barely feel my fingers anymore. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was frozen, locked in place. The figure leaned in closer, its void-like face inches from mine. "And now, you're mine." The last thing I remember is the room going completely silent. No whispers, no hum, just darkness. A deep, suffocating darkness that swallowed me whole. I don't know how long I've been here. I don't know if I ever left. I'm not sure if I'm still alive, or if I've been trapped in that cell this whole time. But I do know one thing. Cell 7 isn't empty. It never was. I was hired to monitor a government lab. The test subjects are not human. Okay, so this is gonna sound insane, but I swear everything I'm about to tell you is 100% true. I've been holding on to this for a while, but I think it's time I share what happened to me. I don't know if I should be scared for my life or not, but it's eating me alive. So here goes. It all started when I was in a pretty rough spot. I was in my early 20s, fresh out of school, and couldn't land a job for the life of me. My rent was overdue, my car was on its last legs, and the job market was, well, you know, absolute trash. I was living in this dingy little apartment, scrolling through job listings like it was my full-time gig. I'd pretty much given up on finding anything that wasn't fast food or retail, but then I stumbled onto a listing that felt too good to be true. Night shift lab monitor needed, no experience required, $35 per hour. I don't know about you, but $35 an hour is like winning the lottery when you're broke. And the best part, no experience required. I figured it was probably some janitorial gig or data entry at a tech company, but whatever it was, I didn't care. The money was good, and I needed it bad. I clicked on the link. The application was weirdly simple, just basic info, name, address, and availability. No questions about past jobs or references, nothing about skills. I hit submit and figured I'd never hear back. But literally 5 minutes later, I got an email asking if I could come in for an interview the next day. I didn't hesitate. I confirmed the appointment, threw on my best, only clean shirt, and showed up at this unmarked office building in an industrial park about an hour outside of town. It was one of those places you wouldn't even notice if you drove by. No signs, no logos, just a gray windowless building. The kind of place that gives you bad vibes the second you pull into the parking lot. But hey, I was desperate. I walked inside, and the receptionist greeted me like they'd been expecting me. I didn't even have to say my name. "You're here for the night monitor position, right?" she asked, with this weird, tight smile. She didn't look up from her computer as she handed me a clipboard with a short contract to sign. I skimmed through it, but it was mostly legal jargon about non-disclosure agreements and stuff like that. I didn't care. I just wanted the job, so I signed it. "Great," she said. "Follow me." She led me down this narrow hallway that smelled faintly of bleach and something else. I can't quite describe it, but it was off. The walls were plain white, but there was something unsettling about them, like they were too clean, you know, sterile in a way that felt unnatural. Anyway, she brought me to this small room with a desk and a couple of computer monitors. Sitting there was this guy in a white lab coat, classic scientist vibes, thin glasses, balding, totally looked like someone out of a sci-fi movie. "Mr. Harris, good to meet you," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Dr. Keller. You'll be working under my supervision during the night shifts." I shook his hand, but he barely even looked at me, more interested in the paperwork than in me. He flipped through the contract I'd signed and nodded approvingly. "Okay, you're all set. Let me explain your responsibilities." Here's where it got strange. My job, apparently, was to sit in this tiny room and monitor a series of cameras. There were 8 feeds, each one showing different parts of what he called the facility. Most of them were just hallways, storage rooms, that kind of thing. Nothing exciting. But then there was the 9th feed. He didn't show it to me right away, but he mentioned it, said it was off limits unless there was an emergency. He made me promise, literally made me swear, that I would never, under any circumstances, access that 9th feed. He said it was for authorized personnel only, and that my job was strictly to monitor the other 8 and report any anomalies. If something went wrong, I was supposed to call him immediately. Simple enough, right? I was a little weirded out by how serious he was, but again, $35 an hour. I nodded along and told him I understood. The shifts were long, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., but I'm a night owl, so I didn't mind. Plus, it's not like there was a ton of work to do. My job was literally to sit there and watch cameras. Most nights, nothing happened. I'd bring a book, scroll through my phone, and occasionally glance at the monitors. Easy money. But then, about 2 weeks in, things started getting off. It was a Thursday night, and I was halfway through my shift. The facility was dead silent, as usual, and I was bored out of my mind. I had the monitors up in front of me, one eye on the camera feeds, and one eye on some dumb YouTube video. That's when I noticed it. On camera 3, one of the hallway feeds, I saw a door slowly open. Now, this was odd for a couple of reasons. First, the doors in this place were heavy, like industrial strength, heavy. They don't just open on their own. Second, I was supposed to be the only one in the building. No one else worked the night shift, except for the occasional janitor, and they never worked this late. I leaned in closer, watching the screen, but nothing came out of the door. It just stood there, slightly ajar, like it was inviting me to look closer. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, but I tried to shake it off. I figured maybe the air system kicked in or something, causing the door to open. Still, I couldn't stop watching that feed. That's when I heard it. A faint tapping sound, coming from somewhere down the hallway in the building. I muted my YouTube video and listened closer, but the sound stopped almost as soon as I focused on it. I glanced at the other feeds, but nothing else was out of the ordinary. Everything looked still. I tried to ignore the pit growing in my stomach and went back to my video, but something about that open door stuck with me. It wasn't until about an hour later, when I heard the tapping again, this time louder, that I started to realize I wasn't alone. And then, the 9th camera feed blinked on. The moment that 9th camera feed blinked on, my stomach dropped. I wasn't supposed to have access to it. Ever. Dr. Keller had drilled that into my head. So why the hell was it showing up now? I stared at the screen for a solid minute, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The feed was grainy, like an old security camera, but I could still make out enough details to know something was really, really wrong. The room it showed was... I don't even know how to describe it. It wasn't like the other parts of the facility. The others were sterile, well lit, like a typical lab or storage area. But this place, it was dark, the only light coming from a dim bulb hanging in the center of the ceiling. The walls were this weird, dirty concrete, and the floor looked damp, almost like it was wet, but I couldn't tell with the poor quality of the video. In the middle of the room, there was a large steel table, the kind you'd expect to see in a morgue. But the thing that really freaked me out, the thing lying on the table, I couldn't get a clear look at it, but it wasn't human. It was big, way bigger than a person, but its shape was all wrong. It was covered in this pale, leathery skin, and there were these long, spindly limbs that hung off the sides of the table, too long to belong to any normal animal. And its head, or what I assumed was its head, was turned away from the camera, but even from the side, I could see it was huge, way too large for its body. I wanted to look away. Every instinct in me was screaming to turn off the feed, call Dr. Keller, and just go home. But I couldn't. I was locked on the screen, my eyes glued to the creature on the table. It wasn't moving, but something about it felt alive, like it was waiting. The tapping sound came again, louder now, echoing down the hallways of the building. It was sharp and rhythmic, like metal striking metal. I glanced at the other cameras. Nothing. The hallways were still empty, the doors all closed. I tried to tell myself it was just the air system again, maybe something mechanical, but my gut told me otherwise. I kept watching the 9th feed, unable to pull myself away. The longer I stared at it, the more wrong it felt. The creature on the table looked like it had been sewn together, like different pieces of animals stitched into one body. And there was something else, too. Something subtle, but chilling. The camera had audio, barely audible at first, but the longer I listened, the more I could hear it. Breathing. This slow, wet, labored breathing coming from the thing on the table. My skin prickled with fear. It was alive. I was sure of it. I had no idea what to do. I couldn't call Dr. Keller, not without breaking the promise I'd made about the 9th feed. But I also couldn't just sit there and watch this thing, whatever it was, lying there, breathing, waiting. I was about to reach for the phone, screw the consequences, when something moved on the screen. It was subtle at first, just a twitch of one of the limbs hanging off the table. But then, slowly, painfully slow, the creature's head started to turn. I couldn't see its face yet, but I felt my heart hammering in my chest as it shifted. This deep, gut-wrenching sense of dread washed over me. I didn't want to see it. Whatever was on the other side of that face, I knew it wasn't something I could handle. The tapping sound came again, louder than before, and this time it didn't stop. It grew faster, like something or someone was pounding on the walls of the facility. I checked the other cameras, my hands shaking. Nothing. Every hallway was empty. The lights flickered once, then steadied. And then something caught my eye on camera 3, the same hallway where I'd seen the door open earlier. I leaned in, squinting at the screen, and my blood turned cold. The door was still ajar, but now something was standing just inside the frame. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with limbs that stretched out far beyond what should have been possible. It was like a shadow, this black silhouette, but it wasn't human. It was too thin, its arms too long, fingers scraping the floor. The figure didn't move, didn't step into the hallway. It just stood there, in the doorway, watching. I felt my throat tighten as I glanced back at the 9th feed. The creature on the table was now fully turned toward the camera, and I wish I could tell you what I saw, but I don't know how to describe it. Its face was a twisted mess of features that didn't belong together. Multiple eyes, too many eyes, spread unevenly across its skull. The skin was stretched tight, like it was barely holding everything inside. And its mouth. The mouth was the worst part. It stretched too wide, splitting its face almost in half, filled with jagged, broken teeth that looked like they'd been shoved into its gums at random. It grinned at the camera, this horrible, unnatural smile that chilled me to my core. I slammed my hand on the power button, cutting the feed, but the image stayed burned into my mind. That grin, those eyes. I sat there trembling, trying to catch my breath, when the phone on the desk rang. I jumped, my heart nearly exploding in my chest. I stared at the phone for what felt like forever before finally picking it up. "Mr. Harris," came Dr. Keller's voice, calm as ever. "I see you've accessed the 9th feed." I couldn't speak. My throat felt tight, my mind racing with everything I'd just seen. "I warned you," he continued, "but it seems you're curious. Most are." I tried to find my voice. What is that thing?" I stammered. There was a pause on the other end. Then he said, "It's not your concern. All you need to know is that you shouldn't have seen it." Before I could respond, the line went dead. And then, from down the hallway outside my room, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps. Coming closer. My heart was pounding so loud, I was sure whoever, or whatever, was in the hallway could hear it. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and each step seemed to echo longer than the last. I stared at the door to the monitoring room, half expecting it to fly open at any second, but it didn't. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. My mind was racing. Should I lock the door? Should I hide? I didn't know what to do. All I knew was that something was out there, something not human. I held my breath, waiting for the sound of the door handle turning, for the thing to come inside. But then, nothing. No movement, no sound, just this crushing silence. The air felt heavy, like the entire building was holding its breath with me. I stood there frozen, afraid to move, listening so hard I thought my ears would bleed. I couldn't take it anymore. I slowly crept over to the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. I just needed to know. I needed to know if it was still out there. I don't know what I was thinking, but maybe some small part of me hoped that it was all in my head, that my mind was playing tricks on me after seeing whatever the hell that thing was on the 9th feed. I gripped the cold metal handle and turned it as quietly as I could, opening the door just a crack. The hallway was empty. Relief washed over me for a second, but then I saw it. The door at the end of the hallway, the one I had seen on the 3rd camera feed earlier. It was wide open now, not just cracked like before, and even from where I stood, I could see something inside, something dark shifting just beyond the frame. I blinked, and it was gone. I stepped back into the monitoring room, shutting the door quickly behind me. What the hell was going on in this place? My head was spinning. I wanted to leave, just walk out of the building and never come back. But something told me it wasn't going to be that easy. I was in too deep now, and whatever this was, it wasn't done with me yet. I sat back down at the desk, trying to gather my thoughts. The 9th feed was still off, thank God, but I couldn't stop thinking about that thing I'd seen, the twisted creature on the table, the way it had smiled at me, like it knew I was watching. And then there was the shadowy figure in the hallway. Was it connected to the thing on the table? Was it the same thing? I didn't know, and the more I thought about it, the more questions I had. That's when I noticed something. One of the monitors was glitching. Camera 5. It showed a small storage room, mostly filled with boxes and equipment that didn't seem important. But the feed was flickering now, static cutting in and out, the image warping in ways it shouldn't. I leaned closer, squinting at the screen. For a second, the static cleared, and I saw something in the corner of the room, behind the stacks of boxes. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, but as I stared at it, I realized it wasn't just a shadow. It was moving. The shape was subtle at first, just a slight shift in the darkness, but then it started to take form. Something long, thin, like a limb, stretching out from the corner and then pulling back. My throat tightened. It was like it was testing the air, feeling its way around the room. I flipped through the other cameras frantically, trying to see if there was anything else moving, but everything else seemed normal. Empty hallways, locked doors, the same sterile rooms I'd been watching for weeks. But camera 5, something was in there. I had no idea what to do. Dr. Keller had made it clear I was supposed to report any anomalies, but I couldn't shake the feeling that calling him would be a mistake. He knew something I didn't. Something about this place, these creatures. I couldn't trust him. Not after the way he'd spoken to me on the phone. Not after he'd warned me not to look at the 9th feed, and then it just showed up like it was daring me to break the rules. I glanced back at camera 5. The shape in the corner was still there, but now it was taller and closer. It was standing, almost like it had uncurled itself from the shadows. I could see it more clearly now. Its arms were too long, its legs bent at an odd angle, like it wasn't meant to stand upright. And then its head shifted, just slightly, and I saw the reflection of two pinpricks of light, eyes staring directly at the camera. My chest tightened. It was looking right at me. Suddenly, the monitor flickered again, and the shape disappeared. I checked the other cameras, flipping through them one by one, but it was gone. The storage room was empty again, just boxes and old equipment, like nothing had ever been there at all. I rubbed my face, trying to shake the growing sense of dread that was wrapping itself around me. I needed to get out. Whatever was going on here, I wasn't safe. But as I stood up to leave, the lights in the room flickered, and the whole building seemed to groan, like it was coming alive. Then, out of nowhere, the 9th feed turned on again. This time, the room was different. The table was still there, but the creature was gone. The camera was zoomed in slightly, showing the far wall of the room, which was covered in this strange, dark substance. It looked almost like veins, these thick, black tendrils creeping along the walls and floor, pulsing like they were alive. I could hear something too, a faint, wet, squelching sound, like something was moving just out of frame. My hands were shaking as I reached for the power button again, ready to cut the feed, when I saw it. The creature was back, but it wasn't on the table anymore. It was standing in the far corner of the room, hunched over, its back to the camera. Its limbs were stretched out, and it was doing something to the wall, scraping at it, digging into the dark veins. I watched in horror as it turned slowly toward the camera, and that same twisted grin spread across its face. But this time, it wasn't alone. Behind it, standing in the shadows, were more of them. Dozens of figures, tall and thin, with those same unnaturally long limbs and the glowing eyes. They were watching me, just like the creature had before. And then, as if on cue, they all started to move. Slow, jerky movements, stepping closer to the camera. I didn't wait. I slammed the power button, cutting the feed, but the image stayed burned into my mind. They were coming for me. I knew it. And that's when I heard the door to the monitoring room slowly creak open behind me. The door behind me creaked open so slowly, I felt each second stretch out, like it was designed to torture me. I could hear the faint, metallic sound of the hinges, the groaning echoing off the sterile walls. My breath caught in my throat as I froze, too scared to turn around. For what felt like an eternity, I just sat there, listening, waiting. My eyes darted to the monitors, but everything was off now. Just black screens, my one lifeline to knowing what was happening in the facility, gone. The silence was suffocating. I could feel something behind me, standing just beyond the threshold of the door. I couldn't hear footsteps, but I felt it. This thick, oppressive presence, like the air had become heavier, colder. I don't know how I mustered the courage, but I forced myself to turn my head, just enough to peek over my shoulder. The door was cracked open, maybe a foot, just wide enough to see the dimly lit hallway beyond. But there was nothing there, at least, not that I could see. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought I might pass out from the sheer terror of it. I got up slowly, inching my way toward the door. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to close it, lock it, and hide. But I had to know. I had to see what was out there. I reached for the door and pulled it open, bracing myself for whatever was waiting on the other side. The hallway was empty, but it didn't feel right. You know how sometimes you walk into a room and you can just tell someone's been there, like the air is still thick with their presence. It felt like that, like the hall had just been occupied by something and it had only just slipped out of view. I stepped into the hallway, my shoes squeaking against the polished floor, the sound echoing off the walls. The door at the far end, the one that had been open before, was now shut, tightly. I swallowed hard and started moving toward it, my legs shaking with every step. As I walked, I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced that if I looked back too quickly, I'd see something creeping up behind me. But there was nothing, just the faint hum of the building's ventilation system and my own ragged breathing. When I reached the door, I hesitated. Everything about it screamed at me to turn around, to leave. But something drew me to it, like I was being pulled by invisible strings. My hand hovered over the door handle, my fingers trembling. It was cold, colder than it should have been. I took a deep breath and twisted the knob. The door opened with a soft click. The room beyond was dark, pitch black, except for a faint glow coming from the far corner. I stepped inside, the air immediately feeling colder, thicker, like walking into a freezer. The glow grew brighter as my eyes adjusted to the dark, and I realized it was coming from the same strange black tendrils I'd seen on the 9th feed. They were crawling up the walls of the room, writhing like they were alive, pulsing with that faint, sickly light. In the center of the room was something I hadn't seen before. It looked like a large glass tank, about 7 feet tall, with tubes running from it into the walls. The tendrils seemed to be growing out from the base of the tank, twisting and coiling around it. And inside, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. There was something floating in the tank. It looked like a person, but not exactly. Its skin was translucent, and through it, I could see black veins running along its body, just like the ones on the walls. It was curled into a fetal position, its eyes closed, and its chest rising and falling slowly, like it was sleeping. But the closer I looked, the more I realized this thing wasn't alive. Not in any way I understood. Its limbs were too long, its joints bending in ways they shouldn't, and its face. I could barely make out any features, just vague impressions where eyes and a mouth should have been. I took a step back, my whole body shaking. What the hell had I just walked into? That's when the thing's eyes shot open. I stumbled back, knocking over a metal tray behind me. The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot. The creature in the tank didn't move, but its eyes were locked on me. Black, hollow pits that seemed to pull the light out of the room. My chest felt tight, like the air was being sucked out of my lungs. I backed up further, my feet nearly tripping over the thick tendrils that covered the floor. Suddenly, the tank started to hiss. Steam billowed out from the cracks where the glass met the metal base, and the tubes connected to it began to vibrate. I knew in that moment I needed to get out of there. Whatever was happening, whatever this thing was, it was waking up. The tendrils around the tank were pulsing faster now, almost like they were feeding it energy, preparing it for something. I turned and bolted for the door, slamming it shut behind me. My heart was racing as I ran down the hallway, my feet slipping on the polished floor. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I had no idea if that thing had gotten out of the tank, and I wasn't about to find out. When I reached the monitoring room, I threw myself inside and locked the door. I sat there panting, trying to catch my breath, when I noticed something I hadn't before. There was a small metal panel under the desk, slightly ajar. I hadn't paid much attention to it before, but now something about it seemed off. It looked like a hatch of some kind. My hands were shaking as I reached down and pulled it open. Inside was a small black box, about the size of a shoebox, with a blinking red light on top. Attached to the side was a card with a handwritten note. "In case of emergency." I hesitated, my mind racing. What kind of emergency were they talking about? My gut told me that whatever was happening in this building was way beyond any normal emergency, but I had no other choice. I was trapped, and that thing in the tank was waking up. I had to do something. I opened the box. Inside was a small handheld device, like a radio or some kind of transmitter. It had a single button on the side, glowing faintly. There was another note inside, hastily written, "Don't press unless there's no other way." I stared at the device, my mind spinning. No other way. What the hell did that mean? Was this some kind of self-destruct button? Some kind of kill switch? The building groaned around me, the lights flickering again. I could feel the walls closing in, the weight of everything pressing down on me. I had no idea what was coming next, but I knew I didn't have much time. I gripped the device in my hand, my thumb hovering over the button, and then, from outside the door, I heard it. The tapping. That same slow, rhythmic tapping that I had heard earlier, only this time. It was closer, much closer. I clenched the device tighter, my mind screaming at me to press the button. Whatever was out there, whatever was coming, it wasn't human. It wasn't something I could fight or run from. It was something else, something that shouldn't exist. And then the door handle started to turn. The door handle turned slowly, creaking as if whoever or whatever was on the other side wanted me to know they were coming. My whole body was frozen. The tapping had stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. The kind of silence where you can hear your own pulse, feel your skin crawl with anticipation. I gripped the black box tighter, my thumb hovering over the button. My mind was screaming at me to press it, but some deep-rooted instinct kept me from doing it. What would happen if I did? Would the building explode? Would that thing from the tank somehow get even worse? I had no idea what kind of emergency this was designed for, but I could feel the weight of its importance. This wasn't just a panic button. It was something final. The door handle finished turning. The latch clicked. I held my breath as the door began to swing open, just a crack at first, and then wider. Slowly, so agonizingly slow, it revealed the dark hallway beyond. I squinted into the darkness, but for a moment, I couldn't see anything. Just the familiar dimly lit corridor, empty. My heart was pounding in my ears, adrenaline pumping through my veins, and then it stepped into view. It wasn't the creature from the tank, not exactly, but it was something else, something born from the same horror. Its limbs were impossibly long, just like the shadow I'd seen on camera 3, but this time it was closer. So close, I could see the way its fingers bent at wrong angles, the way its skin barely stretched over its bone-thin frame. It moved in jerks, like it didn't quite understand how to use its body. And its face. God, its face. It was blank, smooth, like a mannequin without features. No eyes, no mouth, just pale, stretched skin where its face should have been. But I could feel it looking at me. Even without eyes, I knew it was staring at me, studying me. My entire body locked up, fear taking over every rational thought. It didn't move at first. It just stood there, halfway in the doorway, its head cocked slightly to the side. like it was curious about me, like it wanted to see what I would do. I knew I had two choices, run or press the button. Neither option seemed great. Running meant I'd have to get past that thing, and pressing the button, well, I didn't even know what pressing the button would do. The creature twitched, its long arms dangling at its sides like dead weight. It took a single step forward, the sound of its foot hitting the floor, echoing unnaturally in the tiny room. My instincts kicked in. Without thinking, I grabbed the chair next to me and threw it at the creature. It didn't even flinch. The chair clattered to the ground, but the thing didn't react. It just kept walking, slow, deliberate steps, each one bringing it closer to me. Its head was tilting further now, almost at an impossible angle, like it was broken, or bending in ways no human body should. I took a step back, my back hitting the cold wall. There was nowhere to go. I was cornered. I couldn't take my eyes off it. I could feel my chest tightening, every muscle in my body locking up with fear. It was only a few feet away now. I could smell it, this faint, rotting stench, like decayed meat and something chemical, something wrong. I had to do it. I had no other choice. With trembling hands, I pressed the button. For a split second, nothing happened. The creature kept advancing, its long bony fingers reaching out toward me, and I was sure that I was done for. I was sure that pressing the button had done nothing. But then, the entire building seemed to shudder. A low, deep rumble vibrated through the floor, and I heard something mechanical, like gears shifting, deep within the walls. The creature stopped. It stood still, its head twitching slightly, as if it was confused. The lights in the room flickered violently, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. And then I heard it, the faint sound of something being released, like gas hissing through the ventilation system. The creature's body jerked unnaturally, its limbs twitching as if it were being pulled by invisible strings. It started backing up, its movements even more disjointed than before, as if it was trying to fight against something. The air in the room grew thick, and a sharp, metallic smell filled my nostrils. Whatever gas was pumping through the building was meant for them. The creature stumbled backward into the hallway, its limbs flailing as the gas seemed to paralyze it. Its head snapped violently from side to side, that blank face still staring at me with invisible eyes. Then slowly, it began to disintegrate. I don't know how else to describe it. The pale, stretched skin began to peel away, flaking off like ash in the wind. Its long arms crumbled into dust, falling to the floor in soft, silent piles. Within seconds, the thing was gone, just a pile of ash where it had once stood. I didn't have time to process what I'd just seen. The building was shaking now, that low rumble growing louder. The gas was still hissing through the vents, and I could hear more noises, heavy footsteps, screeches, things moving in the shadows of the building. The others, the ones I'd seen in the 9th feed, they were in the facility, and the gas, whatever it was driving them out. I didn't know how much time I had. I grabbed the black box, shoved it into my bag, and bolted for the door. I ran down the hallway, my footsteps echoing off the walls. The building groaned around me, the lights flickering so fast I could barely see where I was going. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The air was thick with that metallic stench, and I could hear things moving in the walls, in the vents, creatures scraping at the metal, trying to escape. I reached the exit door, slamming into it with all my weight, and burst out into the night. The cold air hit me like a wall, sharp and biting. I didn't stop running until I was halfway across the parking lot, my lungs burning, my mind still reeling from everything I'd just seen. I glanced back at the building. The lights inside were flickering violently now, and I could hear a faint hum, like machinery winding down. And then it went dark. The entire facility, silent, dead. I stood there for a long time, panting, staring at that building, waiting for something else to happen, waiting for another creature to come crawling out, for the nightmare to continue. But it didn't. Eventually, I got into my car, my hands still shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to leave. I had to get as far away from that place as possible. I've been driving for hours now. I don't know if they're still after me, if that gas killed them all, or if they're out there somewhere. I keep glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see one of those long, twisted figures standing on the side of the road, waiting for me. And the black box, it's sitting in the passenger seat, that red light still blinking softly. I don't know what it means. I don't know if pressing that button saved me, or if it triggered something even worse. All I know is I'm never going back. Whatever they were experimenting on in that lab, it wasn't human. And whatever they were trying to contain, it's not over. It's just beginning.